I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being there. She was the only one, so I think she carved her own role. And she smiles, they light up her whole face.
Inside Buckingham Palace, a battle was brewing that no one could have predicted. As whispers turned to roars, King Charles made a decision that shook the monarchy to its core, forcing Queen Camilla to step aside amid growing allegations of betrayal. Behind the gilded walls, courtrooms were being divided, alliances shifting, and a queen's ambition began to surface. What began as a marriage built on love and duty was now a high-stakes game of power. The question echoed in every corner of the palace: would the monarchy survive this internal war, or would everything they fought for crumble? Camilla, once considered the queen consort, had become a figure of intrigue.
As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and which reminds us of the vital parliamentary traditions to which members of both houses dedicate yourselves with such personal commitment for the betterment of us all.
For years, she had played her part in the royal family, presenting a calm and collected image for the public. But the cracks within their marriage had been steadily growing. The royal duties, the constant media scrutiny, and the quiet moments in the palace had all contributed to a change in her demeanor. Where once she had appeared as the supportive spouse of Charles, she was now seen as a queen with her own ambitions. Inside the glittering walls of Buckingham Palace, tensions between King Charles and Camilla began to show. On the surface, they still performed their royal duties together, attending events and greeting dignitaries as if everything was normal. They smiled for the cameras, exchanged pleasantries, and moved through the crowd as a unified front. But for those who paid close attention, there were moments when it was hard to ignore the strain. Charles's eyes seemed to wander during conversations, as if his thoughts were miles away, while Camilla's laugh came a beat too late, her hand resting on his arm not out of affection, but out of duty. One royal correspondent, standing at the edge of the room, remarked that there was something brittle about the scene, like a porcelain vase just waiting to crack. Charles, for his part, began to feel the weight of this unspoken tension more with each passing day. The crown, which he had believed would unite his family and bring peace to his marriage, now seemed like an ever-growing burden. The palace, once a place of comfort and legacy, felt more like a gilded cage. Camilla, ever the skilled royal, had perfected the art of maintaining appearances. She wore her emerald gown like a queen, her smile as rehearsed as ever. But there was something in her eyes, something sharp, almost guarded. She had long known that appearances were paramount in this world. Even if her marriage was unraveling in the quiet moments, the public would never know. If she smiled the right way, wore the right jewels, the world would believe everything was fine. But it was a performance she knew all too well. As the evening progressed, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He looked out over the palace grounds, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance, but his mind wasn't on the grand event unfolding inside. He thought back to when he first ascended to the throne, when he still believed that his reign would bring stability to both the monarchy and his family. Now, all he could feel was a growing unease. The tension between him and Camilla was palpable, and it was clear that their marriage was no longer the united front it once appeared to be. For Camilla, the public event was another stage where she had to maintain the perfect royal image. But in the moments when the cameras weren't watching, she too could feel the distance between them. The connection they once had seemed to be slipping away, and she was learning that in the world of monarchy, loyalty was often as fleeting as the next headline. It was a marriage that had once been built on shared history and mutual support, but now it felt like a power struggle. The more they smiled for the cameras, the more hollow the gesture became. They exchanged pleasantries, but the words were empty. They moved through the evening like actors in a play, each one knowing their role, but neither truly invested in it. Charles, who had always been the thoughtful and cautious royal, was now confronting the reality of his position. He could feel the walls closing in, both within his marriage and within the palace itself. In the far corner of the room, one of Charles's closest advisors noticed the tension. The words of the monarch's private secretary lingered in the air. If only the public knew what was really going on. But those words, although heavy with implication, were drowned out by the laughter and clinking of glasses around them. The evening passed in a blur of smiles, handshakes, and polite conversation. But Charles couldn't ignore the weight of it all. By the time the last guests left, the palace had fallen silent once again. For a brief moment, Charles stood alone in the great hall, staring at the empty space where the glittering crowd had once been. The scent of perfume still lingered in the air, but it was no comfort. In the quiet of the palace, the king allowed himself a moment of reflection. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. He had once believed that the crown would bring his family together. Now he was faced with the reality that the crown might be the very thing driving them apart. And in the darkness of the palace, as the lights dimmed and the echoes of the evening faded away, Charles felt the weight of the decision he would eventually have to make. The game was changing, and the stakes were higher than ever. What started as a private struggle within the walls of Buckingham Palace was about to become a public battle for the future of the monarchy itself. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace grew increasingly tense as whispers of a plot began to circulate. Behind the grand walls of the royal residence, where opulence and tradition blended seamlessly, something far more sinister was unfolding. Camilla, once the queen consort and a symbol of royal harmony, had begun to subtly shift her position. No longer just a figurehead beside Charles, she was quietly, carefully, positioning herself for something greater, something more than the role she had been assigned. In the private, dimly lit rooms of the palace, Camilla's actions were far from idle. Her evening gatherings were no longer simple royal functions, but quiet meetings where she met with those who might help her achieve her ambitions. The curtains were always drawn tightly, ensuring privacy, and her trusted staff guarded the door, making sure that no one entered without her invitation. This was not just about royal duties anymore. It was about building alliances, securing her future, and positioning herself to take control if the opportunity arose. The conversations held in those private rooms were far different from the ones the public witnessed. To those on the outside, Camilla was still the dutiful wife of the king, standing by his side during royal events, offering support when needed. But in private, her words took on a different tone. She spoke with her confidants in quiet, measured tones, her voice often betraying the seriousness of her intentions. It was during these moments that she would reflect on Charles's leadership, often suggesting that while he meant well, his leadership was not strong enough to secure the future of the monarchy. "He's too soft for this role," one of her close confidants overheard her saying. "Someone has to take charge if this whole thing is going to stay intact." Her words, heavy with implication, would resonate long after they were spoken, filling the halls of Buckingham Palace with a sense of unease. Staff members, moving between the private quarters and the royal offices, would catch fragments of these conversations, snippets of words that seemed innocent on the surface, but hinted at something more. "If someone doesn't step in," another overheard remark said, "this whole thing will fall apart." While the whispers grew louder within the palace, the outside world remained blissfully unaware. But as the days passed, the media began to catch wind of a shift in the royal dynamics. Seemingly out of nowhere, newspapers and tabloids began to praise Camilla's decisiveness and leadership, her ability to take charge in uncertain times. Articles appeared with glowing profiles of her, highlighting her clarity of vision and her ability to connect with people. These stories, while flattering to Camilla, painted Charles in a different light. The king was portrayed as indecisive, hesitant, even overly sentimental. Headlines focused on his struggles with leadership, portraying him as a monarch unsure of his place in the modern world. The shift in the press coverage was impossible to ignore. It was not just the articles themselves, but the timing that seemed so suspicious. Camilla's favorable stories appeared with increasing frequency, often followed by critical pieces about Charles. The media was suddenly painting a portrait of the royal family in disarray, with Camilla positioned as the strong, steady hand that the monarchy needed to weather the storm. But for those inside the palace, it was clear that the press wasn't just picking up on a story, it was being fed the narrative. Someone inside Buckingham Palace was carefully orchestrating this shift in public perception. One of Charles's closest aides, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, began to worry. It was not just the press or the whispers that concerned him. It was the subtle changes in Camilla's behavior. At official events, she carried herself with an ease and authority that seemed to grow with each passing day. She was quick to voice her opinions, sometimes interrupting Charles in meetings or stepping forward to greet guests before he had a chance. There was no malice in her actions, but there was a subtle shift. Camilla was no longer the quiet, supportive consort. She was a woman who knew the power she held and was not afraid to wield it. "She's building her own court," one of Charles's most trusted advisors quietly warned him. "She's surrounding herself with people loyal to her first, and to the crown second." It was a warning that Charles did not take lightly, but even as he tried to process the implications, the palace continued to shift around him. Some staff members began to align themselves with Camilla's growing circle, sensing that she might soon have the power to shape the monarchy's future. Others, though, remained loyal to Charles, wary of what might happen if the balance of power tipped too far in Camilla's favor. Inside Buckingham Palace, the subtle power play was unfolding. The courtiers, once allies of the king, began to quietly distance themselves, aligning with Camilla or choosing to remain neutral. Charles, for his part, remained largely unaware of how deeply the palace had divided. He focused on his royal duties, trying to maintain the image of a strong and united family. But the signs were everywhere. The royal staff had already begun to take sides, and the rift between Charles and Camilla was only growing wider. One day, while reviewing his correspondence in his private study, Charles came across a letter that stopped him in his tracks. The letter, written by one of his most trusted political allies, was filled with praise for Camilla, describing her as a decisive leader who was more than capable of guiding the monarchy forward. But it was the handwritten note in the margin that caught Charles's eye. "The crown must be in capable hands. I am ready when the time comes." Charles read the words again, his heart pounding. This was not idle gossip or palace chatter. This was written proof of Camilla's intentions. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. For months, he had dismissed the whispers as mere speculation. But now, with this letter in his hands, he could no longer ignore the truth. Camilla was positioning herself for something more than just influence. She was ready to take control if the opportunity presented itself. As the days passed, Charles's unease grew. The subtle shifts in the palace, the press coverage, and the growing whispers were all pointing in the same direction. Camilla was not content to simply play her part as queen consort. She wanted more, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get it. Charles, who had once believed in the stability of the monarchy, now found himself facing a challenge unlike anything he had ever imagined. The battle for the future of the crown was no longer just a matter of family dynamics. It was a matter of survival. And the most dangerous game was just beginning. As tensions escalated, the divide within Buckingham Palace deepened. Some courtiers continued to whisper that Camilla was the stronger leader, the one who could lead the monarchy into a new era. Others, however, remained loyal to Charles, believing that he was the rightful king and that he had the experience and wisdom to guide the nation through its challenges. But the line between loyalty and ambition was becoming increasingly blurred, and the future of the monarchy hung in the balance. With each passing day, Charles could feel the palace closing in on him. His authority was being questioned, and the royal family's unity was beginning to unravel. The whispers that had once been mere speculation were now undeniable truths. The question was no longer whether Camilla would make her move. It was when. And when that moment came, it would change everything. The tension inside Buckingham Palace reached a boiling point as Charles's worst fears were realized. The subtle whispers, the shifting allegiances, and the calculated moves by Camilla had all led to this moment. It was no longer just a matter of suspicion. The truth had finally revealed itself in a way that could not be ignored. In his private study, Charles found himself staring down at the letter that would change everything. The words, penned by his own queen, were stark and unmistakable in their intention. "The crown must be in capable hands. I am ready when the time comes." For a long moment, he sat frozen, the paper trembling in his hands. It was a blow he hadn't seen coming, even though deep down, he knew it had always been a possibility. The idea that Camilla, the woman he had fought so hard to be with, might be plotting to take the throne was a bitter pill to swallow. He had always known there were power struggles in royal families. Betrayals, ambitions, and rivalries were as old as monarchy itself. But this was different. This wasn't just palace intrigue. This was personal. This was his wife. The letter was not the only evidence that had come to light. A few days after its arrival, a recording surfaced, one that would leave Charles reeling. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. Camilla, calm and measured, spoke of his declining health and the need for someone to take charge of the monarchy. "Someone has to think of the monarchy's future," she said. "If I must take charge for the good of the institution, then so be it." Charles listened to the recording multiple times, each repetition gnawing at him, eating away at the sense of betrayal he could no longer ignore. The woman he had trusted most, the woman he had fought for and defended, was now speaking as though replacing him was her rightful destiny. It wasn't just what she said that shook him to his core. It was the casual way she said it, as if it were a foregone conclusion. He could hear the certainty in her voice, and it chilled him to the bone. Later that evening, Charles confronted Camilla in the solitude of their private quarters. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but Charles could no longer remain silent. He had to know the truth. How long had she been planning this? Was this all part of some grand scheme, or had he simply been blind to her ambitions? Camilla entered the room, her emerald gown trailing behind her, unaware of the storm brewing in her wake. She was poised, as always, her face a mask of calm. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice steady. Charles didn't move from the window, his back turned to her as he tried to collect his thoughts. The rain outside, steady and unrelenting, matched the turmoil inside him. He turned to face her, his expression hardening. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, his voice low but filled with an edge of steel. Camilla froze, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to read the room. "Planning what?" she replied, her tone laced with feigned confusion. Charles stepped forward, his gaze unyielding. "Was it all a plan from the start?" he demanded. "You used people to get what you wanted. Is that why you divorced Andrew Parker Bowles? Because he no longer had any worth to you?" His voice rose with each word, the anger breaking through the restraint he had carefully maintained for so long. Camilla's lips parted in disbelief, or perhaps indignation, but Charles cut her off. "Do not lie to me. Not tonight. Not after I have seen the letters. Not after I have heard the recordings." Her expression faltered for a moment, but it quickly shifted to something colder, more calculated. "That's absurd," she said quickly, her voice sharp. "You're twisting everything." But Charles was not so easily deterred. "Do not lie to me," he repeated, his tone now fully accusing. "Not after everything that's come to light. I brought you in, Camilla. I fought the whole world to be with you. And you?" Charles stopped himself, the weight of the words nearly choking him. He had never imagined that the woman he had loved would be the one to bring him down. The anger, the sense of betrayal, all hit him at that moment. He had trusted her. He had believed in her. And now it felt like everything had been a lie. But Camilla's response was as cold as the room itself. "And what would you have me do?" she asked sharply, taking a step toward him. "Stand by while you let this institution crumble? Watch you dither and hesitate while the world questions your every decision?" Her voice dropped lower, her words cutting deeper with each syllable. "Weak leadership?" she repeated. Is that your justification? Is that the excuse you tell yourself when you plot to take my place? The words hit Charles like a slap. She was no longer the woman he had fought for. She was a rival, a force to be reckoned with. The realization was gut-wrenching. The woman who had once been his partner in everything, his ally, was now positioning herself to take what was his. For the first time, he saw her not as his wife, but as a threat. He stood there, his breath heavy, his chest rising and falling with barely contained rage. "Weak leadership?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. "Is that what you tell yourself when you plot to take my place?" Camilla took another step toward him, her eyes flashing with determination. "If you can't rule, someone must," she said, her voice now icy and unrelenting. "And I won't let this family collapse because you're too afraid to act." Charles felt the weight of her words settle on him like lead. It was the final blow, the last shred of hope he had clung to, that somehow things could return to what they once were, was now gone. In that moment, he realized that whatever love or loyalty had once existed between them had been replaced by something darker. Their partnership had been a facade, their shared history, a distant memory. The argument erupted in full force, the harsh words flying between them like daggers. Camilla denied, defended, and countered with a ferocity that matched his own. Her voice rose, her anger matching his. And before long, the tension between them reached a breaking point. A vase, an heirloom passed down through generations, was swept off the mantel and shattered on the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass was sharp, violent, and final. Neither of them flinched. The destruction of the vase was symbolic of the destruction of everything they had once shared. Camilla's face was flushed, her hands clenched at her sides. "You think this is betrayal?" she demanded. "This is survival, Charles. If you can't see that, then perhaps you're the one who's lost your way." The words stung, but they also served as a brutal reminder that this was no longer a marriage based on love and mutual respect. It was a battle for power, a battle for control over the monarchy. And in this battle, there could only be one victor. With one last cold glance, Camilla turned on her heel and strode toward the door. Her emerald gown swayed behind her, and for a brief moment, Charles saw the woman he had once loved. But that vision quickly faded, replaced by the image of someone entirely different. Someone who had no intention of stopping until she had taken what she believed was rightfully hers. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the palace settled into an uneasy silence. The echoes of the argument between Charles and Camilla reverberated through the corridors, leaving behind a palpable tension that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The royal family, once seen as a pillar of unity and strength, was now on the verge of collapse. The battle for control over the monarchy had entered a new phase, and it was clear that there was no turning back. Charles, though shaken, knew that the next step had to be decisive. He could no longer afford to wait or hesitate. The monarchy, the institution he had spent his life serving, was in jeopardy, and it was his responsibility to ensure its survival, even if that meant making painful decisions. The weight of the crown, which had once seemed like a symbol of stability, now felt like an unbearable burden. But Charles was no stranger to responsibility, and he knew that the time had come to act. The palace, once a place of grandeur and tradition, now felt like a battleground. The courtiers, staff members, and even family members had been forced to choose sides. Charles's advisors, those who had always supported him, urged him to take swift action. "You must act now, Your Majesty," one of them insisted. "The longer you wait, the more power she will gain. If you don't make a move, you may find that you have no throne to return to." But Charles, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew the stakes were high, but he also understood the delicate balance of power within the royal family. A wrong move could destroy everything he had worked for, and the monarchy's centuries-old reputation could be shattered in an instant. And yet, the truth was undeniable. If he did not act, Camilla would continue to consolidate power until it was too late. The decision was made. Charles would publicly announce that Camilla would step back from her royal duties. It was a choice that would surely divide the nation and the royal family, but it was a necessary one. The monarchy, for all its history and prestige, could not survive if it was torn apart from within. Charles knew that this was a risk, but it was a risk he had to take. The announcement was made with a gravity that reflected the magnitude of the situation. Standing before the cameras, Charles's face was drawn, his expression one of regret and resolve. "Loyalty to the crown must come before personal ambition," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "It is with deep regret, but with absolute necessity, that I announce the Queen Consort will be stepping back from royal duties indefinitely." The words hit like a thunderclap. The media, which had been buzzing with rumors and speculation, immediately erupted in a frenzy. Headlines flashed across newspapers, and news outlets from around the world covered the announcement. The public reaction was swift and divided. On one hand, there were those who praised Charles for taking control of the monarchy and putting the institution above personal matters. On the other hand, there were those who saw this as an act of betrayal, a monarch willing to cast aside the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin. In Buckingham Palace, the mood was no less tense. Staff members, who had once been loyal to both Charles and Camilla, now found themselves caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty. Some quietly supported the king, believing that he had made the right decision for the future of the monarchy. Others, however, were uneasy with the choice, fearing the consequences of alienating Camilla, who had gained significant influence over the years. As the days passed, the divide within the palace deepened. The courtiers, who had once gathered in royal chambers to discuss matters of state, now found themselves whispering behind closed doors, their loyalties shifting like sand. Some, sensing an opportunity, aligned themselves with Charles, hoping to ensure their place in the future of the monarchy. Others, more loyal to Camilla, began to slip away, quietly offering their support to the Queen Consort, despite her exile from royal duties. The press, meanwhile, had a field day. Headlines shifted with the tides of public opinion, some painting Charles as a strong leader, willing to make the difficult choices necessary to preserve the crown, while others labeled him as a tyrant, a man willing to sacrifice everything for his own sense of power. The media was as divided as the palace itself, and both sides played their parts, feeding the narrative that suited them best. But while the public and the press focused on the royal family's infighting, Charles found himself retreating further into himself. The man who had once been so confident in his role as monarch now felt increasingly isolated. The weight of the crown had never been heavier. He had always understood the complexities of royal life, the diplomacy, the public appearances, the endless expectations, but nothing had prepared him for the personal toll this conflict would take. In the privacy of his study, Charles pored over his correspondence, his thoughts consumed by the events that had unfolded. It was a lonely existence, this life of monarchy. The advisors who surrounded him offered counsel, but their words often felt hollow. There was no one left to turn to, no one who could understand the unique burdens of being a king. But as the days stretched into weeks, something shifted. The tension that had once seemed insurmountable began to take on a new form. Charles realized that while Camilla had been a formidable force in the palace, the monarchy was still his to lead. He had been born into this role, raised to carry the weight of his ancestors' legacy. It was his responsibility to ensure that the monarchy survived, even if it meant confronting the harshest truths. Meanwhile, Camilla, now removed from the public eye, retreated to her private estate. But even in exile, she was not idle. Her supporters, loyal to her vision of the monarchy, rallied around her. She was not a woman to be cast aside easily. Despite her removal from royal duties, Camilla continued to work behind the scenes, gathering allies and strategizing her next move. The whispers in the palace, which had once spoken of her ambitions, were now speaking of a queen who was still very much a player in the royal game. At her estate, Camilla spoke in private to those she trusted. "I may be gone from the palace," she said one evening over a glass of wine, her tone sharp and determined. "But the game is far from over." She understood the palace better than anyone. She knew its weaknesses, its pressure points, and its fractures. While Charles may have thought he had won, Camilla was already plotting her return. She would not go quietly. Her absence from the royal scene was simply a strategic retreat, a chance to regroup and build a stronger case for herself. The monarchy was not a simple institution, and she was not one to give up her claim to it easily. In London, Charles could feel the pressure mounting. His advisors, once unwavering in their support, were now suggesting that it might be time for Camilla to take on more duties. "In the interest of stability," one of them offered quietly, "it may be best to allow Camilla to step back into a role that suits her strengths." The implication was clear. Camilla was becoming the face of the monarchy, whether Charles liked it or not. But the king, though weary, knew that he could not afford to concede any more ground. The monarchy was his to lead, and he would not allow anyone, not even his wife, to take it from him. The final blow came one afternoon when Charles received an anonymous letter, a note that seemed to confirm his worst fears. "The queen you cast aside will be the one to bring you down," it read, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. The scent of Camilla's favorite perfume lingered in the folds of the paper, a reminder that she was always just a step away, lurking in the shadows. As Charles read the letter, he felt the weight of his decision settle in. The monarchy was at a crossroads, and the choices he made in the coming days would shape its future. His advisors, once loyal and supportive, now looked at him with uncertainty. Some believed he had done the right thing, while others feared that the decision to remove Camilla from the throne would be his undoing. Charles knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he understood that the future of the monarchy would not be determined by the whispers in the palace or the headlines in the press. It would be determined by his actions, his choices, and his ability to navigate the complex world of royal politics. The crown had demanded its price, and he had paid it. But the game was far from over.